do, that with my lips I may bear witness to the truth of your way. With your word in my heart, I delight more than with the world's riches. I listen in the silence, awaiting the clarity of your counsel. May I become a living fountain of joy and give thanks to your bountiful blessing. I give myself into your hands, that I may live fully into your word. Open my heart's eyes, that I may see the wondrous blessings of creation. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Well, I've just passed out the suggested resource list, and this is just really a beginning. You know, there's more out there, but this would constitute kind of the foundational documents of the Camaldolese congregation. And I believe that you have these books in the bookstore. Some? Okay. So I'll hold these up so that you can see what they are. You already, of course, know about the privilege of love, which the monks at the Hermitage would say definitely this constitutes their best gathering of information about history, practice, theology, all that stuff. And they have some wonderful essays in there. And so on the resource list for this particular topic of the charism, I've tried to zero in on the sections of that book or chapters that would be particularly helpful, you know, that actually directly address the charism. And then this one's very interesting too. It's one of the translations of their two oldest documents, which are the Life of Saint Romuald and the Mystery of the Five Brothers, or the Story of the Five Brothers, depending on who's translating. And this one was translated by Peter Damien Belil, who was a longtime monk at New Camaldolese. He is no longer there, but quite a scholar, did a lot of writing for them. And then there's a similar book. It collects the same two foundational works of the Story of the Five Brothers and the Life of Romuald. This is translated by Father Thomas Mattis. And I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to meet him, but we've only had him locally, so to speak, for probably the last 2 or 3 years. He spent about 20 of his years as a monk, at least 20 or 25, in Italy. He's an American-born monk. He was up at the Hermitage for a few years, and then he wound up in Italy, and they had him stay at the Mother House in Camaldolese for years. And he is just an incredible gold mine of historical information, speaks fluent Italian, and he was told to do this book as part of their series. You can see the covers are very similar because they self-publish, well, not self-publish, but there was a small publishing company called Source Books down in LA that did these for them. So specifically as resources for people who come to the Hermitage. And Thomas Mattis was told, we want you to make this more friendly and personal and user accessible than the straight translations. So it's kind of delightful to read this. He's got his own personal story of struggling to be a young monk, going over to Italy, trying to fit into this ancient monastic world there. And so I hadn't reread this for quite a long time, and I was just talking with him about a week ago when we went up for the ceremony when this monastery was taken in officially to the Camaldolese world. And he was laughing about this book because it's been so many years since he wrote it. I'm a different person now. I said, well, I should hope so. It's been a long time. And then this book, Camaldolese Spirituality, this has got some of the other documents translated, and one of the other really ancient ones was the first set of constitutions written by someone known as Blessed Rudolph. And Blessed Rudolph, when you start reading his view of what it takes to be a great monastic community, a spiritually healthy, a beautiful community rooted in koinonia and the primacy of love, you can pick that up from reading what he says to his monks, that he was a gentle soul, but he had a real vision, for what would work in the community. I think, are the most recent constitutions 1983?
They are.
Yeah, okay.
But there was a revision in 1990-something.
Yeah.
So maybe I can say something about the revision?
Yeah, go ahead. Hop up.
Let me just stand.
Okay.
When the Second Vatican Council came along, they asked every religious community to revise their constitutions. Now, some of you living in California may have heard about some fallout with one group of sisters who did that. The Immaculate Heart Sisters had to, because the Vatican said, renew their constitutions like everybody else was going to do. They were the first to do it. And the Archbishop didn't like their new constitutions, so he shut them down. But anyway, that's just a commercial that everybody had to come up with new constitutions that were in the spirit of the Second Vatican Council. Because, the old constitutions just weren't. Although they had the charism, they had it in language that contemporary people didn't really understand. And so in the 80s, the Camaldolese had their constitutions, approved because you had to go through the Vatican to get them approved. And number 3 of the Vatican II constitutions said, the hermitage is the characteristic element that guides all Camaldolese life. Now, when that came out, some people were like,
Could you repeat?
The hermitage is the characteristic element that guides all Camaldolese life. Some people said, well, we're Camaldolese, but we're not living in hermitages. What is this? What is this all about? The leadership of the Camaldolese congregation over the years has been incredible. The prior generals have always been, far-looking. And so one prior general put on the agenda for the next general chapter, we have to do something about Article 3 of the Constitution. And what they put was, the threefold good is what characterizes and guides all Camaldolese life. Life in community, life in the hermitage, and life in the mission on the road. Evangelization. So, the latest constitutions of 1993 are very different. They're very like everything else, from 1980-something, except Article 3. And that's what we've been doing today. We've been looking at how we can put Article 3 into practice as oblates.
And I think that's the beauty of, number one, having a rule by which to live, and then having these constitutions which give directions on how this is played out in real life. All of that contributes to that trellis and gives us a mental picture of what it is that we're now part of. And what boggles my mind, and it certainly did when we were celebrating the 1000th anniversary, which was a couple of years ago, in our first big assembly of worldwide oblates. Just that notion that we're having 1,000-year-old, and we're having 1,000 birthday party here. And that we were supposed to be looking forward to the next 1,000 years. And, I was having doubts that the world would even be here in 1,000 years. But it's certainly, it's a very hopeful vision when you can look back and see what's gone before and all these different personalities that have been part of this. And one of the huge blessings of my life, and I know some of the rest of you who are sitting here also, experience this was being able to go on pilgrimage, on a Camaldolese pilgrimage to Italy. And I did that in 2002. And we stayed, of course, at the Mother House at Camaldolese up in the mountains overlooking the Tuscan Valley, and walked the road up to this ancient Roman road up into the Holy Hermitage that Romuald built himself with his 5 original hermits. And there's still a cell there that was, they call it Romuald's cell. I'm not sure if that's the one he lived in, but you can go in there and sit and pray in Romuald's cell. So that really brings things alive. Their house in Rome, which is right next door to the Sisters of Mercy, Mother Teresa's order. Sisters of Charity or Sisters of Charity. So there they are. They're white and they're blue and, all night long, homeless people rattling their gates to come in, and their little nun would open up and then they would go. And, to really begin to plug into the fact that we haven't reinvented the wheel at all here. This isn't an experiment. Yes, Melanie.
I was wondering if maybe both could clarify what is the difference between hermitage and monastery.
Oh.
If we here now are still considered a monastery.
Mm-hmm. Steve?
Yes, we're still considered a monastery.
Mm-hmm.
Hermit is where hermits live.
Well, and specifically, they live in separate dwellings. So, at New Camaldolese, there are something like, I don't know how many, I think 28 or something, separate cells on the side of the mountain, even though they're all within an enclosure together, and even though they operate as community by doing the same thing you do here, they live in their separate cell. And so that's what distinguishes them. Traditionally, the cenobium or monastery was more of almost a dormitory style situation at some points, or like you are a shared house or whatever. So it's all meant to increase the opportunities for solitude when you're in a hermitage. Did you have a question, Connie? Okay. One other thing I wanted to point out in this delightful book, which is called Camaldolese, A Journey into Its History and Spirituality, and it's listed on there, is just this long section about some of the characters, that have been part of, it's called Historical Figures. And it makes for really not just interesting, fascinating reading, but it will also give you a sense of what they meant by the threefold good. How did they, 800 years ago, see that as working in their own lives? What did they do because they were trying to live that out? A last book that is wonderful, but I'll tell you ahead of time, as a writer, it is so full of typos. It's terrible, and I don't know why they didn't. Anyway, no line editing on this book whatsoever, but it's written by Thomas Mattis, who's a wonderful writer, and it just kind of encapsulates everything. It's the monastic life of the Camaldolese Benedictines. I know it's available at the Hermitage in the bookstore. I don't know if it is here. But anyway, it kind of takes the whole privilege of love and squeezes it into this one little, easy to read except for the typos book. And finally, one that I love, which is not in print, but we can get this to you because we have permission from the writer. It's a master's thesis written by an oblate named Randy Swearingen. And it was done, back in 1999. And he chose to focus his whole study up at the Graduate Theological Union on the Camaldolese Benedictine Threefold Good. And the subtitle is Seeds of Growth for the Christian People, which I thought was a really interesting and significant title. He must speak Italian. I don't know Randy, but he dives into some, strictly Italian sources. But he, I think, does a marvelous job of pulling together how the threefold good gets traced through the history of the order. And he'll cite all the different, along the way, the different versions of the constitutions and the significant documents. So, and it's very, very accessible. That's what I really appreciate. It's of course done in academic style, but it's not written academically. It's really written like a story, and I appreciated that a lot. So if you would like to get a hold of this My job will be scanning this thing because I haven't done that yet. I've made some copies, physical copies for a few people, but we could scan this and email it to you if at some point you would like to.
Why did I just pin myself that way?
Janet, you could scan it. What else was I going to tell you? Just so you can have it in your head, the next assembly, Camaldolese assembly for Oblates, will be, I mentioned, up in San Juan Bautista in the Franciscan house up there, and it will be on the weekend of August 18th. And they'll be sending out probably information, I'm guessing in May or something. So that may be something to put on your list as a possibility of getting together with other Oblates. Also, a wonderful thing has happened in the sense that it came completely unexpectedly, a gift from the sky. A few months ago, I got an email from a woman who told me she was a journalist for PBS, for Public Broadcasting System, TV, public TV, and that she had just contacted Cyprian, who was about to go out the door for 40 days. He went on a long round-the-world trip in which I mentioned before he was giving retreats in Australia and Singapore and places like that. And so he had bounced her over to me and said, because she was interested in oblates. And she had been to the Hermitage many, many years ago and fell in love with it. And she lives on the East Coast, hadn't been able to come back. So she decided she wanted to tackle this story. So we spent a lot of hours talking together. And they came up and filmed late in November on a weekend. I was up there giving a retreat with Brother Bede. And it's going to be a very small thing. It's like 8 minutes or less as part of their religion and ethics show, which is like a news hour they have. And that show's been on for 20 years and has just finally lost its funding from the Lilly Foundation. So the end of February will be the end of that particular show, but we're going to be on it before it's over. Now, tentatively, it's scheduled for, you'll never believe it, inauguration night.
Inauguration day?
Yeah, we're going to be competing with. I have a sense they're thinking about this, and so I'm supposed to find out on Tuesday.
Oh, maybe we won't be competing.
Yeah, maybe we won't.
So that's on PBS.
PBS, yeah, and I think
People an option.
it gives people an option, let's put it that way. Yeah, and I think that for someone who really didn't know a lot about any of this when she started, she just worked really hard to learn as much as she could. Interviewed Cyprian and Father Robert and me and a lot of... So it's having to squeeze all that into a very short period of time. I think she's doing a good job with it. So, and you know how beautiful those shots would be up there. Mm-hmm. So that's something... I'm happy about it because to me it fits into the third good. Mm-hmm. It's an evangelization tool. I mean, it's something that who knows who's going to see this, mm-hmm. and it's and who is going to strike as a way to, oh, maybe I could do this. I've been hungry for something and I couldn't identify it, and all of a sudden something is speaking to me in this.
What is her name again?
Her name is Kate Olson. Yeah, Olson. Yeah.
So Paula, you can let us know when that is.
I definitely will, Mary Pat, wherever you are. I'll let you know as soon as I find out on Tuesday, and then you could send out an email, and I'll let you know, Steve, too. So I don't know if the two lists have been combined yet.
They have.
Okay.
Oh.
And if anyone is not on Mary Pat's list, please see her today before you leave.
Yeah, make sure. And particularly if you live within driving distance of here, because, we're often doing things here for just all kinds of neat stuff, and you might want to know about that. So anyway, well, I wanted to circle back to the topic of community or the privilege of love, because I had to respond to your comment about monks and nuns being angels, street angels, and house devils. And that reminded me of one of my all-time most amazing experiences of community gone awry. And that was years and years ago, I got asked to do a retreat in in western Minnesota, which is a very, very rural area. It was dead of winter. I mean, it was freezing. There was snow everywhere, and they said, well, it'd be best if we put you in this one particular little town, and I'm not going to tell you the name of the town because it's so small that if you know this town, you're going to know who these nuns are. So anyway, little farm town in western Minnesota, and a little convent, and they'd been there for years, and I was supposed to stay with them and eat my meals with them, and then I was supposed to drive and do these retreats around. So I didn't expect them to want any kind of retreat out of me. I thought they were just housing me, But no, right away they said, no, we want you to do a retreat for us too. And I said, okay, what would you like me to talk about? We want to talk about forgiveness. I said, well, I always, I have given retreats on forgiveness, and that makes my heart sink because that is a very powerful, and deep topic. And if people sit with that for a few days, all kinds of things begin to happen. Actually, I gave one of those retreats when you were at Pecos. Yeah. And remember how all hell broke loose? Yeah. So, anyway, so I said, okay, this isn't going to be a retreat. There were only 6 nuns. I said, let's just sit in the living room and have some coffee and we'll talk about forgiveness. And that was okay with them. But they said, as long as you're willing to afterwards meet privately with us. Okay. I should have figured out something was going on. So I did my little talk, and they all listened. Nobody said a word. Nobody offered any personal stories during this group session. Then there I was, parked down the hall in this little room with the door closed, and one by one, people started coming. And after about 3, some of that was pretty mild, and I thought, do they think this is confession? Because I'm not qualified to do confession, They just wanted to talk. And then this woman came in, a nun who'd been there for a number of years, and she told me that I had noticed that their prioress was kind of, in some ways, she had a disability. She had difficulty walking. She had a cane, and she wasn't an older woman. She was, probably in her early 50s or something. And the little facial paralysis, things like that. So this other sister comes in, and who's the sub-prioress, and tells me, for years and years and years, she had lived there and had assumed that someday she would be the prioress of this little place. All of a sudden, they ship in this new woman, and who's not even American, she said. She came from Venezuela. Oops, I gave you a hint. Now you're going to know who these nuns are. And she couldn't even speak English that well, but somehow or another she became the prioress, and this second woman could not figure out how the community could have done this, how they could have possibly voted her in, passing herself over. So she said she went into a period where she was so angry all the time. And it came out in the form of constantly watching her new prioress like a hawk, watching her for any kind of mistake she could possibly make, keeping track of all of it in her journal, I don't know what for. Maybe she was going to go to somebody or other. And she said this began eating at her to the point where there was literally nothing her prioress could do that didn't displease her. Well, one night they had to go to some kind of Christmas function, and it was the dead of winter in Minnesota, and the streets were icy and blah, blah, blah. And she's driving, and her prioress is sitting next to her with a tray full of, roast beef, with, aluminum foil over it. And she said, and that woman, she was so prone to falling asleep at the drop of a hat, and I just knew she was going to fall asleep and drop that tray, But what could I say? She's the person who decided to carry. I offered to put it in the back. So they're driving along, and she keeps looking at her to make sure she's not dropping this grease all over. And all of a sudden, the woman does nod off, and the tray goes, and all the grease pours. And this woman driving got so enraged that she crashed into a telephone pole, wrapped the car around the pole. The prioress was in a coma for like a year. It's not funny. She was left with, nerve damage, all this stuff. And this had all happened about 5 years before. And she said, from that point on, this has been my cross. Because nobody knew. Nobody knew that it was her, the toxicity of not forgiving that had literally caused practically manslaughter, because it was her rage that had kept her from watching the road. And so I just, it's such a crazy story that in some ways I still have a hard time believing it, but I never forgot it either. And she said, I said, how have you dealt with that? How have you dealt with, of course, obviously, the guilt? And she said, I have made myself her absolute servant. When she came out of the hospital, she had a long time of rehabilitation and everything. She was her total caregiver. And I said, how do you feel about her now? And she said, I love her now. And that, Connie, you talked about the people you like the least, if you're with them, more and more, you're the one who brought that up, right? And it reminded me of my kind of not great relationship with my mother-in-law, who became very ill, fell and had a brain hemorrhage and brain surgery. And suddenly, she has 5 sons, no daughters, and I'm the closest female relative. And I wound up in a very intense caregiving situation with somebody I really had never learned to like much. And by the time she died, I could honestly say I loved her. And it was that act of physically caring for another person. So part of community building is definitely this business of serving one another in whatever capacity that requires. And however onerous it is, and often it is. Often we don't elect to be in that position, but we are. There's something about, especially physical care for another person, that can generate that kind of deep love. I used to hope, because we wound up caring for 3 different aged parents before they died. And it was not easy for any of the 3 or us. And I used to think, before that happened, I hope and pray that my children never have to care for me, because I don't want to be a burden. And now, hey, I hope they have to. And it is for their own good, how else are they going to learn this kind of love unless they do, And so the hard part will be me getting over my wounded pride that I have to be cared for, but it can be a great blessing. Community nowadays in our wider culture is there's such a longing for it, and people are so unaware of that's exactly what they're longing for, Instead, we try to find community or not we, but I think a lot of people will try to find community by gravitating toward people who agree with them. And especially in the political sense nowadays. People with whom they feel totally at ease to say what their personal opinion is, but they know they can't just say that out in public. Not a great way to form community. Community needs to include different kinds of personalities, different kinds of, settled opinions about a lot of stuff. And years ago, Father Robert up at the Hermitage gave me some much-needed advice when I was grappling with the fact that, we were having some struggles in our local Oblate group. Part of it was we were just less mature and wise than we are now, 20 years later. But that it was a kind of power struggle going on for whose vision of this is going to prevail, who's right, who's off in left field or whatever. And we're wrangling with each other. And I went up and dumped all this on Father Robert. And he said, in this little group of brothers up here, we have got such an array of personalities, of backgrounds, of, strongly held opinions about all kinds of stuff. And he said, what saves us and allows us to transcend all that and really be brothers who love each other is this act of praying with one another 4 times a day. You can't hate the person you pray with. You just can't, or you're not really praying. If you're sitting there in disgust, you're not really praying. And so that was really good advice for me, and it makes me love this Oblate community all the more, because I feel like it offers the safe common ground for all of us to be part of. But for people who are kind of floating on the outside seeking community, they're intensely lonely. They might think, especially young people, they might think that the loneliness they're suffering is because they don't have a significant other yet. They're not dating someone, or they're not married, or they don't have kids. Often they don't know what they're really longing for is a community, a real community. And I taught at Cal Poly for a lot of years, and I taught writing, so my students were having to bare their souls, and I was having to read the bared soul stuff. And one of the things that came up over and over was their way, of relaxing from all the hard work of going to school was to have parties all the time. And I said, well, what do you do at your parties? Well, the music's really loud, and there's a TV on in every room, and there's a keg, and there's tons of people all squeezed in there. And I said, do you talk? Are you kidding? You can't talk. It's too loud. Well, why do you go? Well, we just want to hang out. And you could see it and hear it in their voices. That talk about a lonely experience, to be somewhere jammed in with 300 people who you weren't connecting with in any way, shape, or form. You were just there together. And that was supposed to be fun. So I think one of the things that this first good has to offer us is also something that we, by employing the third good, can pass on, to a very needy world at this point. So unless you had more to say unless you had a nun story to top mine. I doubt it. Thank you. So I'm going to go to the second good then. Okay. So, second good. Unless you had any final comments or questions about community and how that might play into your lives.
I'm curious about your little nun. Is she still a prioress?
I have not been in touch for a while, but she did stay in touch with me for about 3 or 4 years. And she never mentioned becoming prioress, but she did sound she sounded more at peace, I think. Yeah, more at peace.
See, I always have to have things tied up.
I know. The happy ending.
Or not.
So Paula, as an oblate, then, how does that, how do you integrate the common community? Is it through your own parish or your own life?
Well, that's a good question, yeah.
Model?
Mm-hmm. One of the things that that this journalist asked me right away, because she's not married, has no children, 62 years old, living by herself, has had a very successful life, but she is increasingly feeling, and she's not been attached to a church. I mean, she's Christian, but not really. She's kind of done a lot of that bouncing stuff, church bouncing. And so she was really interested in community. That was one of her first areas to talk about. And she said, tell me, is this true? Is this a true statement that the only real community you have in your life is the Oblate community? I said, heck no. I'm part of a lot of communities, including my family, my extended family. Our neighborhood out in the country in Arroyo Grande has proven to be an incredible community. We help one another. We can count on one another. My parish is a 7:30 Mass. You got to be tough to go to 7:30 Mass. So our particular group of people who are serve on the altar, we're very much a community. I think you can take the values that you learn from this, and then they begin to spread into these. Yeah, exactly. And you become very aware when you are seeing it modeled in front of you. And it can be from someone who is a person of no faith, or thinks they are, But somehow or another, they're open to the working of the Spirit and love. Yeah, Gail.
What you just said, you're a member of various communities. When John and I went to the Oblate Congress in what year?
2009.
2009. The theme was the interreligious dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
So they had leaders of all the 5 different large faiths. And this one nun got up and talked about her community for the Christians. And then she said, as oblates, how do you fit in to your group to follow, what you would call the threefold book? Because that's what St. Benedict's rule really teaches anyway.
Sure.
And so we sat there, and I looked around, and nobody was saying anything, and so I stood up, and I couldn't talk for everyone, so I just told her what our group in Stockton, California did, and how we were taught by Abbot David Garrett and our Oblate directors. And I said, every single member of our Oblate group is active in church, active in community, from theater to St. Mary's Dining Hall, active in ministries within their parish. After that section, we were inundated by everyone who could speak English coming up and saying, oh my gosh, my priest won't let me do this. My priest, we can't do this, we can't do that. Oh, tell us how we can get started. And it showed me how people, most of the oblates in the world, are going to their monastery once a month, and they will do Vespers or whatever and get in teaching and then go home.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Well, I'd have to disagree, knowing a lot of oblates, that there's and when we get to the third good here in a few minutes, we'll talk about some of the things people are doing.
She's talking about the world.
The world. No,
Europe.
what?
Mainly in Europe.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very
Yeah.
restricted.
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. Cyprian has some interesting stories about the International Benedictine Congress he was just attending. He said he felt a little bit like the janitor there. Simple white robe. And everything was very formal. And yeah, so I see what you're saying. You're talking about the more... Yeah, Tony.
Paula, I have a quick question that may or may not fit into this section.
Yeah.
So, where might the prayer, work, and hospitality aspects of Benedictine monasticism
fit into the threefold good? Yeah. Well, I would say that the work and the hospitality portion would probably fit well into the third good, although obviously lapping into community too, because, and we're going to spend a whole one of these sessions on work. That's going to be our last one, so we'll really delve into it then. But that, in a nutshell, the work that's done in a monastic community is not for self-gain or self-promotion. It's for the good of community. It's to keep community going, to keep... And so it becomes a part of community there, too.
So all three could be?
All three could be.
Hospitality.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're all interconnected. Does that sound like a good answer?
Yes, and an image that comes to mind is the actual physical, geographical place where Camaldolese is, and how it has, evolved over the ages. But the hermitage is at the very top, and more secluded. And then you have to go down, a mile
About
or
2 miles, yeah.
2 miles,
Yeah.
and you get to where the monastery is. Now, in the Middle Ages, they built across from the monastery what we today would probably call...
A pub?
In those days, they called it a hospice.
Okay.
But it wasn't necessarily for people who were dying.
Yeah.
It was for travelers who needed a place to stay.
Yeah.
And some of them were sick.
Right.
And so as a result of that, they developed a pharmacy.
Yep.
So, all of this was going on. Intense contemplative prayer at the top. People living community, serving one another. But flowing out of that, serving the needs of, the traveler or whoever who was in need, who happened to show up at your doorstep. Now, in the 20th century, there's not the hostel there, but there's a conference center.
And a huge guest house.
And a huge guest
like
house.
130 rooms. Yeah.
And before Paul VI was the Pope, he went to Camaldolese very often. He was the Archbishop, I think, of Milan. But one of the things that Paul VI was very into was dialogue. And the whole thing of, I don't have the truth. The truth comes when I share my piece of the truth with someone else who shares their piece of the truth. And it was as a result of that the Second Vatican Council made dialogue, one of its top themes. And then when Paul VI became Pope, one of the first things he did, he suggested that it be monks in general, but Camaldolese monks in particular, who would be involved in interreligious dialogue. And so what goes on at Camaldolese today is a lot of that kind of both interreligious, that is with non-Christian, as well as ecumenical kinds of dialogue, that is with Anglicans, Lutherans, etc. But Camaldolese is a big place for that. But interreligious dialogue is looked at not as something academic, but as something that's an outreach of prayer, work, and hospitality. And it's almost as if, but not exactly, way at the top, they're doing the second good. In the middle, they're doing the first good. And in the conference center, they're doing the third good. But all three goods are
intertwined,
swirling around.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I hope that you're not left with that impression that there are these clear-cut divisions between these. These are all meant to feed and intertwine and nourish. And at different times in our spiritual lives, we're in different places. One thing I kept struggling with as I was putting this together, I kept wanting to put solitude first and then community, even though that's not the way the third good is described. It's described as we've talked about today, because I was most drawn to the solitude. And I know a lot of people that wind up at the Hermitage, that's what they get riveted by, the silence, the wilderness, the beauty, the chance to be in their own little place, and there's no cell phone coverage and no internet hookup. They can actually be on retreat. And I was so, I had 4 young teenagers at home at the time and a full-time teaching job, and it was just crazy at home, just noisy and full of action all the time, and and I'd go up there and stay for a day, or even after a day, I would still cry driving down the road because I had to leave that sense of. So you can, at different times in our lives, we're in desperate need of different kinds of spiritual ways, and so this threefold good allows for. Now I feel like I'm almost fully living in the third good at this point, and it's just been a natural evolution, Yeah.
Someone over there asked how they could put the threefold good into their daily lives. I have found I can have solitude at home. I can make time, an hour, start praying the rosary, open the Bible and meditate on a passage, but taking that time.
Yeah, and that's part of the discipline of the life, is to make time for, if possible, for all 3 of the goods every day. Yeah, Katie, what were you going to say?
Well, one thing that I discovered is I work full-time. I run a business at night.
And you have a child.
I'm a mom.
Yeah,
So trying to find time is always really difficult.
Of course.
What are some things for someone who essentially works 16 hours a day?
Yeah.
What are some ways throughout the day?
Well, first of all...
And so it's not just a...
Right. All or nothing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, if I don't get an hour in the morning...
Right. You want to be first of all, very realistic. You just have to be. You can't beat yourself up because you are failing to meet an ideal standard of something. That's not what this is about at all. So just start with where you are, which is what you've described. I found that insomnia was my best friend during those years because I often couldn't sleep, very well. I had just too much on my mind. There was too much going on, and I would wake up. I might fall asleep in exhaustion for 3 hours, and then I'd be wide awake at 1 a.m. But guess what? Everyone in the family was sound asleep. And so that became this solitude and silence in the middle of the night. I'd get up. I wouldn't try to fight it. I'd just get up and go in the living room and, either sit on my cushion in meditation or write in my journal. That was a hugely helpful time for me to just write in my journal because I kept the subject of the journal. I kept trying to put everything into what was happening spiritually. You know what I mean? So it was not a to-do list for the next day. That was the time I had to devote. I taught on campus, and that's a busy place. 18,000 students up there, and faculty and everybody, and my schedule would be all goofy, and I wouldn't have a good chunk of time. But I would always have some kind of break in the day. And there was a little herb garden up there that was in honor of a professor who had died, and somebody told me about it. I found it just had a couple of benches scattered around, and it wasn't by any means silent up there, but it was off the beaten path, and mostly students went up there to sleep. So I'd be surrounded by bodies, and that would be my time of solitude and silence before I went back into the classroom. So you begin to look at life. The very first good spiritual advisor I had happened to be Janet's husband, who I took a class from at Cal Poly. And he was an undercover Christian up there. And when I figured that out and started asking questions, I've been away from faith for 20 years, he suggested, why don't you just try to find 15 minutes before everything in the morning? Just don't even try to pray. Just find some place to be away from your household and your family and before you're caught up and that meant like 5 a.m. or earlier, because that was just the reality of my life. I was working full time too. And it was hard to do it, but as soon as I began to realize I am going to make sure I can count on this time, then it was sort of like in those old movies when you see, medieval times, someone running to get away from, they're a criminal and they're racing for the church and they're saying, sanctuary. That's what it felt like, was my little bench in the morning for 15 minutes was sanctuary in the middle of my day. One of the ways that the community, the monastic community, has sort of in a way to honor and include silence and solitude, even in their liturgy, is to leave those long gaps. If you go to services up there, and sometimes it's pretty funny, there'll be a whole busload of people from a parish who've never been there before, and they get into the service and we start the liturgy and they just want to snap those responses out as fast as, and then there'll be this kind of awkward pause, and then the monks will finally say the same thing. And it takes a little while for them to get into the sync of it. But that is meant to incorporate that solitude, silence aspect of the threefold good. So, we can keep going. So I would say that if there is one thing that sets the Camaldolese apart from other congregations within the Benedictine world, it is this element of solitude and silence. It's the image of the solitary hermit that we get from Romuald. And I've talked already about some of the particular temptations of the solitary or the person who goes into silence. And the fact that Romuald then came up with a solution, which was if they could live together in small groups. And he didn't invent this idea either. This came out of Desert Father times. This was often the pattern, would be a small group of solitaries living around a chapel in the desert, and often they were being advised by an elder, someone who was considered to be wise in the ways of the spiritual life. And that model hung on in Eastern Orthodox monasticism and still exists. They call them skeets. And on Mount Athos, there are still a number of skeets where they have small groups of hermits living around a chapel, with an elder, sort of a charismatic elder. And so that was pretty much what Romuald saw as a way to help hermits and be wise, and that's how he became known as the father of reasonable hermits who live under a rule versus crazy hermits who do excessive kinds of radical things. The great solitaries of the Eastern Church that I was just mentioning use the term hesychasm, Hesychasm, to describe a state of internal silence, stillness, and tranquility, free from strife and anxiety. Hesychasts anchor themselves in the silence and solitude of their individual selves, a practice they believe will teach them what they most need to know about themselves, about God, and about the world. They speak of two forms of hesychism, one being the exterior form, which involves a place. And of course, the primary place is the cell, but often this cell they would try to establish in what they called the desert. And the desert can be New Camaldolese. It means wilderness. It means you're literally physically taken out of the hustle bustle of urban life or whatever in order to have greater silence and solitude. And then this interior form of hesychism is it's an interior withdrawal, a conscious decision to, as it says in the rule, the brief rule of St. Romuald, put the whole world behind you and forget it. Now, this doesn't mean forever, right? This means for this time that I'm in my cell, the thing that I'm hoping will happen in this cell is not going to happen if I've got everything on my shoulders and on my mind and in my heart that I normally am carrying around. It's okay for me to just gently push all that aside as best as I can in order to allow, I love this phrase from St. Aelred of Rivaux, to enter the Sabbath of our rest.
Yes.
Yeah, the Sabbath of our rest. There's definitely a side to this business of hesychism that has to do with rest for the spirit, rest for the soul, rest for the heart. The heart can get worn out loving so much, right? I mean, our greatest tragedies in life come exactly because we love. If we don't love, we might have a very unhappy life, but we don't suffer the deep sorrow of people who do love. Because when we love, we worry, and we bear responsibility for, and all those sorts of things. And so this time of rest, the Sabbath rest that we get in the cell, is the beautiful side of it. The hard side is what we were mentioning before, how it forces confrontation with the self. Connie?
Just a little levity. I know my 11-year-old granddaughter's gecko is dying, and we're having to watch it do its thing, and it's just been
heart-wrenching.
It's the love thing again. It's like, and my little granddaughter, got these little tears because there's no way to really save that gecko. It's just
he's on his way.
He's on his way out.
Is he a leopard gecko?
He's a leopard gecko.
Yeah, my grandson has one too. Not as old as yours.
No, this one's not old.
Oh, he's just dying.
Poor care.
Oh, that's too bad.
But 11-year-old. I tried to take over, but anyway. Well, bottom line is love is painful.
It is painful.
Even if it's a gecko.
Yeah, it's true. So, hesychism is both a practice and a state of being, but of course it is not the ultimate goal of the solitary. Coming to this place of internal tranquility where we aren't constantly at war with ourselves over should I, shouldn't I, am I trying to achieve that kind of peace and tranquility inside is the part of the process and definitely a goal, but it isn't the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal of this whole practice is contemplation or a state of unceasing prayer.
Can I add one more just kind of thing? You're saying trying to find the serenity, and I had decided we weren't going to the exotic pet hospital for like $200. But it's that trying to find that place of serenity in you when there's still angst.
Yeah, of course. Because we're not going to ever be free from that. As long as we're on the earth, we're not going to be free. Trudy, I bet you've lost a lot of friends by now at the age of 96, right?
Thank God for everything I've got nothing ahead of me.
Yeah, right. But in other words, too, the price for living this long has been a lot of grief along the way. A lot of sorrow of saying goodbye. So that's another reason that this whole business of the cell and of embracing silent solitude and getting used to this business of being alone is ultimately, going to help us through everything. Along with giving us some kind of different and deeper opportunity for prayer often. Another way to describe Hezekiah is purity of heart. And this is a term that was used by St. John Cassian, who was one of the sources for the rule of St. Benedict. He was a pilgrim. If you've never read about him or read him before, during the kind of the height of the Desert Father phenomenon, the word got out. There's some holy, wise people out there. You just have to find them, It might take you a couple months of hiking in horrendous conditions, but they're out there somewhere, living in caves or living in these little skeets or whatever. And so Cassian set out with his buddy, who was a fellow monk, Germanus. They were going to just go out for a while, and they wound up wandering out there for 15 years. And they met some of the great desert solitaries of the 3rd and 4th, 5th centuries. Or I forgot his dates, but he came 4th century. And that formed the basis for his Constitution and Institutes. Institutes and conferences. And he also formed a monastery in southern France. And so that was some of the wisdom that Benedict drew on, which means that's some of the wisdom that Romuald was drawing on too. And this term, purity of heart, which is a beautiful and very deep kind of idea, is the ability to focus almost single-mindedly. Kierkegaard, who was not a monastic at all and probably wasn't drawing on this tradition when he said it, he said purity of heart was the ability to will one thing. So Thomas Merton will talk about this point vierge, this virgin point in us in which all comes together in this one important thing in our lives. And that's what the goal of this solitude and silence was to calm us enough, to free us enough from distraction that we could get to what was our essential nature and our essential purpose in life, which was union with God. So today's Camaldolese, of course, still give priority to time in themselves. And oblates, then, the equivalent for us would be regular times of retreat. Really taking this seriously. That it's critical that we have these times of retreat built into a day, even if they're 15 minutes long, like mine used to be. But also that we'll take regular times maybe every few months where we'll go away alone to be in a cell by ourselves and to devote, even if it can only be a half day, in your case, Katie, like Saturday morning sometime. You just go up to Cambria and be on the beach for half a day and be there. Yeah, you can do that.
I never thought about something like that.
Absolutely. When it's done deliberately, intentionally, consciously, it becomes a spiritual practice intended to foster that second good in your life.
That's great, because it's easy to think of. You have to go to the monastery, you have to go to
No.
the hermitage, you have to go to your church, you have to go to...
Yeah.
They have some great benches in Cayucas, too.
There you go.
Where if you really are quick, the 15 minutes, you can just pull right up and the benches are there.
Okay.
When you can sit, get your 15 minutes, you feel so great, just hop back in your car. Not that Cambria isn't good, but that takes a little bit longer usually to find a spot.
That's true. But just put a few miles between you and your family so that you're not tempted to, to get a phone call and race back. I mean, try to really set it aside as a time of retreat for yourself. Also, think about talking. Think about our tongues. It says in the book of James that the tongue is the most dangerous body part we own. A tongue can start a forest fire in terms of the spread of gossip. The kind of political discourse we've had for the last number of years has really had an incredibly toxic effect on our entire society. We've got people so polarized at this point, and most of that has come through the flapping of tongues, right? And so part of the practice of solitude and silence is to practice control over the tongue. And, of course, the Desert Fathers were famous for not saying much of anything. And if you were lucky, like poor Cassian and Germanus, you wander around for 15 years and you finally find one of these holy hermits, and you say, give me a word, and he doesn't get a word for you. And he's not going to give you a fake word. So he'll stay quiet, and you have to walk away. And that's really difficult for especially those of us who are drawn to this, tend to be people helpers. We tend to have compassionate hearts. We tend to think that it's more important to say something, give some semblance of advice than to just sit on that and wait for inspiration or keep quiet. I mean, we can learn something from the Quakers, I think, sometimes. And so building that into our practice is part of that second good of solitude. I'm going to stop there and let Steve, whatever you want to...
Okay, I'm just going to say a few things, and then maybe we can take a break.
Yeah, let's do that.
For finding good.
Okay.
May I have one moment?
Sure, Trudy.
I lost my husband, and I was in that awful state of grief. Everything was wrong.
Yeah.
My neighbor was this lady, Kathy Clay, and she brought me to the monastery. And during that time, I was just relieved of so much stress because I looked forward to coming on Wednesday evening and having a prayer session with the monks and other women and men. And it was just the thing to bring me out of it. It was wonderful.
That's great.
I'm very grateful.
Yeah.
And to
Thank you, Trudy.
She brought you into community, but she also introduced you to that rest of solitary prayer.
And that's how we drag Connie, too. So it's just sometimes we were all at the Mission San Luis, just offering it to somebody. You don't know what they'll say, but maybe you might like this. This might be for you. And that's one thing I miss about living over the grade is not being able to come when they have the Wednesday meetings where you could get prayed over and also help other people. Other people you'd see around that you didn't know would say, that really worked, I got well. Or what I mean, things like that. So it was really a big community as it went out. That it's also a Holy Spirit moment. I'm here. I was at the conference over the hill, the Marian Eucharistic Conference, and I'm in charge of the lunches because I'm president of the Altar Society. Like we're saying, how can you use this threefold and go one step further? So I have 300 people over there that I'm supposed to be helping feeding. But when I was buying some gifts in the gift shop, of course, what did I get? But St. Benedict called me, bought that, and a few other things, and the Holy Spirit said, Kathy, go to the monastery. And the reason I hadn't come earlier is because I had the conflict of time. I couldn't be 2 places at once. I said to myself, do one thing well, Kathy. Stop running around. You always try to do too many things. So just focus on that and do that well. When I went to the gift shop, I thought, oh my gosh, yeah, the monastery. They had it all under control. So I just got in the car, because that's going to go to 9 p.m. tonight. And tomorrow, I thought they'll never know I'm gone. So that's a true story. I'm so proud of that. 300 people still there. I'll show up if they don't even know it.
They won't.
Yeah,
So see?
I'm telling you, true story.
You just entered the Sabbath of your rest.
Yeah.
When Paula was speaking about hesychasm, it reminded me of Abbot David. I don't know if you know, I entered the monastery in Pecos the year after Abbot David was elected. So he was elected in 73, and I entered Pecos in 74. The Abbot David in Pecos, in some ways, was very different than the Abbot David that you people knew here. Remember what I said earlier this morning. Well, the Abbot David in Pecos could be a house devil. And one of his favorite sayings was, shape up or ship out. He said that to Father Ray a lot. But besides that, Abbot David back then, he was much younger. So you knew an older version of Abbot David. When he was younger, he was very much into hesychasm. That was one of his favorite words. You people probably didn't hear him use that word here. And he made sure that in the bookstore there were books on hesychasm. One of them was called The Art of Prayer. And I think the other one was called Selected Writings from the Philokalia, which was an Orthodox anthology with sayings on prayer. And the kind of prayer that both those two books focused on was the Jesus prayer. And the Jesus prayer was Abbot David's favorite. And as I'm looking, John de Gregory, are you wearing the Jesus prayer beads? Yeah. And Gail as well. 100 beads where you say 100 times, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Over and over and over again. One of the things about Abbot David was everyone was welcome in the monastery, and you didn't have to subscribe to everything that was going on there as long as, you could live with it. So although the monastery, was featuring the charismatic renewal, not everyone in the monastery was into the charismatic renewal. Not everyone in the monastery was into the Jesus prayer and hesychasm. But, those were things that were available there, and if you wanted to be into those things, fine. And if you didn't, fine as well. And one of the things that Abbot David asked people if they wanted, this wasn't compulsory. We used to have our earliest morning prayer at 6:30. You could go into the chapel at 5:30 before morning prayer started. And there would be a whole bunch of them sitting on cushions in the chapel in the dark. And they were combining the Jesus prayer with the charismatic prayer. But they were doing it very, very softly, not loud at all. And so what you would hear is people praying in tongues and then saying, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And they weren't doing it loud, and they weren't doing it in unison. One person might be at that end of the chapel, another person might be someplace else, a few of them might be all bunched together. And, if you went in there, you really had to, get your eyes accustomed, otherwise you might, trip over them. But be that as it may, during that hour, every morning, from 5:30 to 6:30, I would really say the second good was really happening through that kind of, hesychasm. And, it wasn't something that was announced. Like when retreatants came in, he never said, get up at 5:30 and join us. If you knew about it, you came. Many people didn't know about it and, never came. But the point that I'm trying to make is that in our tradition, because this house came out of Pecos, that sense of hesychasm was there, back in the 70s, 80s, etc. And of course, I think when they came here, although they might not have brought it with them in the exact same way, I think that sense, is part of what the Monastery of the Risen Christ was all about. So for the Oblates of the Monastery of the Risen Christ, we're not totally bereft of hesychasm. It's been part of our tradition as well. You all know that Father Ray is not well. How shall I say this? He started palliative care, which means that he has not yet started hospice, but that will, not be in the too distant future. And so he wasn't sure, whether he was going to come here today or not. He has limited energy. He's still the house banker and accountant. And what was very important for him today was to make a deposit. That was far more important than seeing oblates. But I think, in a sense, making the deposit took all his energy, which is why, he didn't come down. He was thinking of it. But, he told me, to let you all know that he was with us in spirit today. Yes?
What about Father Stephen? How is he doing in the nursing home?
Father Stephen has dementia, but his physical health is holding. Yes. Uh-huh.
No worries.
No worries. And, we went to celebrate, how long ago was it? In November, his 101st birthday. And, they brought him out of the nursing home to the mission, which was kind of like a place where he goes to Mass. So he went to Mass there, and then there was a little 101st birthday party.
He must be experiencing the Sabbath of his rest.
He is.
But he's funny because you asked him how old he is, he totally knows. He was at 101, right?
Yeah, but he always makes himself a year older.
I said, I hear you're 101, Paula. He goes like this. He didn't say it.
And, every year when the birthday cake comes out, he gets the frosting where the last number is, and he takes it off, and he tries to put in, make it one higher. Yeah. But getting back to Father Ray, one of the things that you may all know is one of his main interests, or one of his interests, is the Beatitudes. Yeah, and he wrote a little booklet on the Beatitudes. And there is a hesychastic beatitude, and Cashin picked that up. And it's, "Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God." Purity of heart has as its reward contemplation, because that's what seeing God is all about. And in a sense, I think Father Ray understands that particular beatitude in that light as a result of, his immersion in the hesychastic experience at Pecos.